This question right here, flaw questions, yeah, I think I mentioned it before, but it's the most common or the second most common question type in logical reasoning. Every section you will see 5, 6, 7 of these questions. 5, 6, 7 of them. Do you know how many questions are in logical reasoning? 24, 25, 26, usually 25. I guess rarely 24. So 25, 26, and 6 or 7 of those questions is a good quarter of the section, right? So a lot of questions on flaw questions. In any case, have I talked about the analogy between flaw questions and the games? Wait, what? Okay, so can someone give me a quick breakdown of what is going on in the games? What are they testing?
Your understanding of the rules.
Your understanding of the rules. So to test their understanding of the rules directly, they could just give you a rule and then ask you to apply that rule, right? But what are they doing in most questions? Make an inference, right, from a combination of 2 or more rules. So in essence, you're given like rule 1, rule 2, and rule 3, and the harder questions may require you to combine them all to figure out that, yeah, T has to go second. That's the answer. In other words, you're combining rules. And by the way, these rules are all silly, right? It's like Sarah has to have her piano lesson before John. No, like that doesn't have to be true. But in this world, it does. But you accept these crazy rules as true, and then you figure out that Tom has to have the lesson second. Okay. Well, in flaw questions, what are they giving you? They're giving you arguments. Right? All flaw questions are going to give you an argument. An argument has what in it? A premise and a conclusion. Now, it could have a lot more, but let's assume that it has 3 premises. What if these premises are crazy? Things like the world will end in 47 days.
Are we talking about games or logical reasoning?
We were talking about games, now we're talking about logical reasoning. So what if one of the premises in the argument was the world will end in 47 days? I mean, I guess it's a theoretical possibility, right? It could end. You all watch Netflix. You've seen 100 shows that have the world ending some way, shape, or form. But even if you disagree with that premise, just like you may disagree with the stupid rule that John has to have his piano lesson before Sarah, you have to accept it as true, and then you decide if together the 3 premises prove the conclusion. Right? So on some level, these 2 things may seem very different, but they're testing the exact same skill. We're going to give you 2, 3, 4 claims, 4 rules, 4 statements. You accept those as true, and then tell us, or the test writers, what must follow logically, what must be true given those claims. Right? And in the games, they give you a bunch of answers, and some of them could be true, but they don't have to be true, or some of them can't be true, blah, 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 whatever, right? In logical reasoning, all they're doing is they're only doing must be true, and the way it works is you accept the premises as true, and then you try to decide whether the conclusion has to be true. And in flaw questions, the answer is always no. It's always no. So, if you read an argument, you identify the premises, you accept them as true, and then you read the conclusion and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That follows from the premises. And then you read the question, and the question says, the error in reasoning is best described as, you say, wait, hold on, you're telling me that this conclusion does not follow logically from these premises. What you want to do is go back and figure out why. Now, the fundamental way to do that, the way that works in the sense that there are no tricks or gimmicks or, like shortcuts, the way that works every time is for you to look at the premises, understand each one, and then decide what they imply together. And once you come to that conclusion, you compare your conclusion to the conclusion that was actually drawn, right? So what often happens is I'll read the premises, I will then come up with my own conclusion, and then I will see how similar or different it is from the conclusion that they drew. Actually, I should probably do it like this, just to make the analogy a little more clear. Okay, so they give you an argument, they draw a conclusion, but before I read their conclusion, I figure out what I think you could conclude from that evidence, and I compare the two. Now, sometimes, actually often, their conclusion in the argument is presented first, right? It's the first thing that you read. The astronauts should go to space, and then they tell you why. Okay, well that's fine. It doesn't really matter where their conclusion appears. What matters is that you find the premises, you decide what they prove, and then you compare that to their conclusion, and there will always be a disconnect. Yes?
Are we always, no matter what the question is, are we always accepting both the premises and the conclusion to be true 100% of the time?
No. You're always accepting the premises as true, and your actual presumption going into these arguments is that the conclusion is false.
Okay.
In other words, in our society, we believe that you're innocent until proven guilty. On the LSAT, I want you to assume that the conclusion is guilty until proven innocent.
Okay.
Right?
But we're always assuming, like, premises are always true in laboratories.
They're always true, unless they are intermediate conclusions. Because an intermediate conclusion is ultimately a conclusion that someone drew on the basis of evidence, and you're like, wait a sec, I don't think that's necessarily true. So anytime someone draws a conclusion on the LSAT, whether it's an intermediate conclusion or the main conclusion, you say, hold up, I'm going to presume that you're wrong until I am convinced that you're right. Right? The presumption is that the argument is bad and the conclusion is not proven until you are compelled by the logic of the premises to accept the conclusion. Does that happen? Yes. It happens about twice a section. Okay? So every other question you're like, yeah, sweet, good job. You're missing something. Right? Now, this is hard work. Right? We were just talking about this in reading comp just a second ago. It's a lot easier to read an argument and be like, yeah, that sucks. And then we say, why does this suck? And you say, it's just bad. It's just bad. And you don't really give a reason, right? And then you read the question, it says the argument is flawed because, and you just start looking for an answer. So imagine for a second that you're in a boardroom, right? You have a job, and someone comes to you and they make this argument. Are you going to be one of the board members that sits there and says, I don't like that argument, that sucks, but I'm not going to say anything? And you wait for another board member to say, yeah, but, and then they give a reason, and you're like, yeah, what she said, that's a problem in your argument. Or are you going to be the board member that says, your argument sucks, and here's why? Right? Are you going to be a proactive test taker where you're listening to what they're saying to you and then you're trying to think through it on your own terms and be like, okay, I see what you're saying, but I think you're wrong for this reason? Or are you going to be a passive test taker and just let the test throw out possible problems to you? There are basically 3 categories. One, which I will put up here, is people, not people, but situations, because this can apply, all these categories can apply to the same person, to you. You read an argument, you see why it's flawed, and you can identify the exact reason that it's flawed, right? In that case, you totally own the argument. You're the person in the boardroom who's saying, your argument sucks for this reason, and let me offer this alternative. Right? You're being proactive. The other situation is where you try to own it. You're like, I know something's wrong here. It doesn't seem like the conclusion is proven, but pinpointing exactly why it's not proven is difficult. This happens on hard questions in particular, right? You're trying and struggling, but you can't see it. The last category I would say is, let's just call it the sleep. That's where you read it and you're like, yeah, that sucks, but you don't try, you don't really have a good reason. Maybe you even just read it and you're like, sounds good to me, right? You're the board member who's like stamping approval to everything. Yeah, cool. I like our president. Whatever she says, I support it and I vote for it on this board, right? As opposed to listening to the reasoning and deciding whether it's flawed. Okay? So, I want you to be in these two categories. It's okay to be in this category. In that case, you've tried as hard as you can, you've thought about why you think the argument sucks, and then when you go through the answer choices, you're hypersensitive to good reasons why it sucks. Right? When you get to the right answer, you're much more likely to be like, oh, I couldn't articulate it, but that is a problem. Right? Versus the sleeper who's like, oh, yeah, I guess, yeah, D could be a problem. Oh, and E, I think E could be a problem. Huh. These both seem like problems. Then you're stuck between 2 or 3, and then you just pick one and move on. Right? Now, the percentage of questions that you can eventually own is going to go up over time. So maybe right now you can own 50% of the questions. You're like, yep, I understand the flaw here, I understand why it's flawed, and I'm ready for the correct answer. And 50% of them you try, but you can't see. But as you keep trying to get up to here, the percentage of questions that you can get up to there will go up. So I would say your goal eventually over time is to own 23 of these 25 questions. Okay? Like there's going to be 2 of them where you're like, there's something wrong here, I can't quite figure it out, but let's go into the answers and I'll find the answer there. Yeah.
What do we do and what type of questions will we encounter when the premises do adequately suffice for the...
Yeah, the only times that the premises do end up proving the conclusion are in questions like conclusion questions, and they just ask you what's the main point. Now, I'm not saying that if a question is a conclusion question, that the argument will be valid. It certainly could be invalid.
Okay.
But if the argument is valid, it can't be a flaw question. It can't be a strengthen question. It can't be a weaken question, or a necessary assumption question, or a sufficient assumption question. All those questions require the reasoning to be flawed.
A necessary or sufficient assumption?
Nope, because if an argument is valid, if the premises prove the conclusion, there are no assumptions. So, in other words, the evidence is sufficient, so you don't need to add any more unstated premises to the argument. Now, so if an argument is valid, then it's either got to be a main conclusion question, or a parallel reasoning question, or a reasoning question, or a role question. That's pretty much it. Or maybe an inference question, which is rare, but it does happen. All right, bottom line, as you're reading these, today I was just I was talking to somebody and they were reading the argument, and when they were done I said, what'd you think of it? What'd you think of the argument? Because it's always like, read the passage, do you think it's a set of facts or do you think it's an argument? They're like, well, I think it's an argument. Okay, great. Do you think it's a good argument? No, I think it's a bad argument. Okay, why do you think it's a bad argument? And when they would describe the argument, they would describe it on this kind of high level. They're like, well, the person starts out talking about a problem, and the problem then gets resolved. That's too abstract. If that's how you're analyzing these things, you need to dig into the actual content and say, okay, I get it. This person was walking down the street and they tripped. Like, you need to see what's actually happening and then decide what has to follow from that. And we'll do some examples so you can see how that works. But the bottom line is really try to understand the passage and decide why the argument is flawed, then go into the answer choices. Arguments can be flawed for more than one reason. So the more reasons that you can identify why the argument is flawed, the more ready you are going to be for the answer choices. Whether it's a flaw question or a weakening question or an evaluate question, it doesn't matter. If you've identified what's wrong with the argument, you'll be ready for the question and the answers. Okay? Now, just to quickly tell you about the differences between the three, in flaw questions, they're asking you to describe the flaw. So we ask ourselves, does this describe exactly what's happening? And is that a problem? In weaken questions, they're giving you 5 new premises, and you're looking for the premise that does the most to hurt the conclusion. So counter premise. In an evaluate question, these are rare but becoming more common. They're basically asking you for a piece of information that would do the most to help you evaluate the conclusion. So the correct answer is going to make you both feel good and bad about the conclusion at the same time.
What does that mean, good and bad?
Well, it's usually like which one of the following is going to do is most helpful in evaluating the argument. And so it's like, well, it would be most helpful to know if most people are aware of this chemical. And so they don't tell you whether most people are aware of the chemical or not. They're just saying it would be helpful to know this. And you're like, yes, it would be helpful to know that most people are aware of this chemical. If most people are, that strengthens the conclusion. If most people aren't, then that weakens the conclusion. So evaluate questions are such that the correct answer doesn't actually tell you any new information. It just says, what information do you want to know? And depending on what the answer is, that would either strengthen or weaken the conclusion.
Are the right answers always yes/no questions?
Not always, but they are a lot of the time.
Okay.
And yes/no is kind of weird because it's like, okay, there's only 2 options here. Either yes, most people are aware, or no, most people aren't aware. You have to decide, is that helpful? Would that tip the scales in some way or not matter? Well, it's easier to see when we do an example. We'll do one tonight.
So would evaluate questions be strengthened questions, or?
It'd be a hybrid between strengthen and weaken, because the correct answer is going to do both. Yeah, I mean, again, when we look at an example, you can see, but that's the idea. Now, okay, any other questions about this? Okay, weaken questions, is this top down or bottom up? Which one of the following is true most weakens the argument? That's bottom up, because it's saying which one of the following is true, referring to the answer choices. So the correct answer is going to be generally stronger, because we're doing the most to weaken the argument above.